The daguerreotype arrived at the Boston Medical Society on March 15, 1862, wrapped in brown paper and bearing no return address. Inside, a haunting image. A pale young man lying peacefully in a coffin, eyes closed, hands folded across his chest, in the traditional pose of Victorian death photography. Nothing seemed unusual about the portrait until Dr. Samuel Hayes noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scratched faintly into the silver surface of the photograph were barely visible marks, tiny lines that appeared to be fingernail scratches, as if someone had desperately clawed at the image from behind. The accompanying note was brief. Thomas Copeland, died February 28, 1861. Millbrook, Massachusetts. May God forgive what I have done. The signature belonged to Dr. Frederick Copeland, a respected physician who had vanished from his practice 6 months earlier, leaving behind only whispers of strange experiments and a brother's mysterious death. Before we continue with the story of the Copeland brothers and uncover the horrifying truth behind this photograph, we need you to join our community of mystery lovers. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. We love connecting with fellow dark history enthusiasts across America. The mystery of Frederick Copeland would remain buried in the archives of the Medical Society for over a century, until a renovation of the building in 1963 uncovered a hidden compartment containing detailed medical journals, correspondence, and most disturbing of all, a collection of similar photographs, all bearing the same telltale scratch marks. Millbrook, Massachusetts, in 1861, was a town caught between two worlds. Nestled in the rolling hills 30 miles west of Boston, it maintained the quiet charm of rural New England, while slowly adapting to the industrial changes sweeping the nation. The population of nearly 800 souls lived primarily from textile mills powered by the swift-flowing Millbrook River, though farming and lumber remained vital to the local economy. The town's single main street was lined with white clapboard houses, their black shutters and stone foundations speaking to the practical Puritan heritage of their builders. The Civil War had cast its shadow over Millbrook, just as it had across the entire nation. Young men who had never ventured beyond the county line found themselves marching south to face an uncertain fate, leaving behind anxious families and a community struggling to maintain its sense of normalcy. It was against this backdrop of national upheaval that the Copeland family had established themselves as pillars of the community. Dr. Frederick Copeland had arrived in Millbrook in the spring of 1859, a tall, lean man of 32 with the kind of intense dark eyes that seemed to see through a person's very soul. He had studied medicine at Harvard and spent 2 years working in the hospitals of Boston before deciding that rural practice would better suit his temperament. The townspeople welcomed him with open arms, particularly after the previous doctor, an elderly man named Hutchins, had died suddenly of apoplexy, leaving them without medical care for months. Frederick had brought with him his younger brother Thomas, a gentle soul of 26, who suffered from what the family delicately referred to as spells, what we would recognize today as severe epilepsy. Thomas's condition had worsened over the years, progressing from mild episodes to violent convulsions that left him unconscious for hours. In an era when epilepsy was often viewed as a sign of moral weakness or divine punishment, Frederick's devotion to his brother was both touching and unusual. The brothers took residence in a large colonial house on Elm Street, its second floor serving as Frederick's medical practice. Thomas, during his lucid periods, assisted his brother by maintaining detailed records of patients and organizing the growing collection of medical supplies that Frederick ordered from Boston and New York. The townspeople grew fond of Thomas, noting his kindness toward children and his remarkable knowledge of medicinal plants, which he cultivated in an extensive garden behind their home. Frederick Copeland's medical practice flourished during his first year in Millbrook, but those closest to him began to notice troubling changes in his behavior as Thomas's condition deteriorated. The younger brother's seizures were becoming more frequent and violent, sometimes occurring multiple times per day. Traditional treatments, bloodletting, purging, and the standard medications of the era proved completely ineffective. It was during the harsh winter of 1860 that Frederick began his descent into what he would later describe in his journals as necessary experimentation. Frustrated by the limitations of conventional medicine and desperate to help his brother, Frederick started researching alternative treatments, corresponding with physicians in Europe and studying ancient texts on herbal remedies. His interest was particularly drawn to the work of Dr. Claude Bernard in Paris, who had been experimenting with plant alkaloids and their effects on the nervous system. Frederick began to theorize that if certain plant compounds could induce paralysis or unconsciousness, perhaps they could also interrupt the electrical storms in Thomas's brain that triggered his seizures. The basement of the Copeland house was converted into a makeshift laboratory. Frederick installed additional oil lamps and acquired glassware, scales, and other equipment necessary for his work. He began with simple extracts from common plants, willow bark for its pain-relieving properties, digitalis from foxglove for heart conditions, and various sedative herbs. His early experiments were conducted on laboratory mice that he acquired from a colleague in Boston. Thomas, aware of his brother's research, became an eager participant in what Frederick described as carefully controlled therapeutic trials. The younger brother was willing to try anything that might provide relief from the increasingly debilitating seizures that were destroying his quality of life. Frederick's journals from this period reveal a methodical approach that gradually spiraled into dangerous obsession. His early entries show careful documentation of dosages, effects, and side effects. He noted that certain combinations of plant alkaloids could indeed reduce the frequency of Thomas's seizures, but the therapeutic window was narrow, and the line between treatment and toxicity was razor thin. As winter deepened, Frederick's experiments became more aggressive. He began working with more dangerous compounds, extracts from belladonna, which could cause hallucinations and cardiac problems, and derivatives of aconite, a plant so toxic that even small amounts could prove fatal. His justification, recorded in increasingly erratic handwriting, was that Thomas's seizures were becoming so severe that any risk was worthwhile if it might provide a cure. The transformation in Frederick's personality became apparent to his patients and neighbors. Where once he had been warm and engaging, he became withdrawn and secretive. He started refusing social invitations and spent most of his free time locked in his basement laboratory. Patients began to comment on his haggard appearance and the way his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. February 27, 1861, began like many others in the Copeland household, but it would end in tragedy that would haunt Frederick for the rest of his days. Thomas had experienced a particularly severe seizure that morning, one that left him confused and weak for hours afterward. Frederick, driven by desperation and perhaps clouded by his own exhaustion, decided to try a new compound he had been developing, a complex mixture of alkaloids that he believed might provide longer-lasting relief. The formula represented months of work. Frederick had been extracting compounds from a variety of toxic plants, water hemlock, which he had gathered from the marshes outside town, deadly nightshade from his own garden, and most significantly, a rare fungus that grew on rye grain, which he had obtained through a contact in Salem. This fungus, known to cause strange behaviors and sometimes death when consumed in contaminated grain, contained alkaloids that Frederick theorized might interrupt seizure activity. As evening approached, Thomas suffered another severe episode. Frederick later wrote that watching his brother's convulsions that night filled him with such despair that he abandoned his usual caution. Instead of administering the small test dose he had planned, he gave Thomas nearly 3 times the amount, convinced that a stronger dose might finally provide the breakthrough they desperately needed. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Thomas's seizure stopped abruptly, but instead of the peaceful relief Frederick had hoped for, his brother's body became rigid, and his breathing became so shallow as to be almost imperceptible. Thomas's pulse slowed to barely detectable levels. His skin grew cold and pale, and his pupils became fixed and dilated. Frederick worked frantically through the night, trying everything in his medical knowledge to revive his brother. He administered stimulants, applied hot compresses, and even attempted the controversial practice of electrical stimulation using a primitive galvanic device. Nothing worked. As dawn broke on February 28th, Thomas remained in the same death-like state, showing no response to any stimulus. Faced with the horrifying possibility that he had killed his brother, Frederick made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could not bear to face the legal consequences of his experimentation, nor could he endure the scandal that would destroy not only his career, but also his brother's memory. In a moment of panic and desperation, Frederick decided to declare Thomas dead of natural causes. Frederick's decision to conceal the truth required careful planning and steady nerves, qualities that his grief and guilt made difficult to summon. He spent the morning of February 28th preparing Thomas's body for what would appear to be a normal death from epilepsy, a condition that was known to sometimes prove fatal during severe episodes. The first challenge was Thomas's physical appearance. The compounds Frederick had administered had left his brother's skin with an unnatural pallor, and his limbs rigid in a way that didn't quite match normal rigor mortis. Frederick used his medical knowledge to address these issues, applying cosmetics to restore some color to Thomas's face and manipulating his limbs to achieve a more natural position. More problematic was the question of witnesses. In a small town like Millbrook, deaths were community events, and it would be expected that neighbors and friends would come to pay their respects and offer assistance. Frederick needed to control who saw Thomas and when, ensuring that no one with medical knowledge would have the opportunity to examine the body closely. Frederick's solution was to claim that Thomas had died during the night of a particularly severe seizure, and that the trauma of the episode had left the body in a condition that made viewing inadvisable. He emphasized Thomas's long struggle with epilepsy and suggested that a peaceful, closed casket service would be more appropriate than subjecting mourners to the disturbing evidence of his brother's final moments. The townspeople accepted this explanation without question. Thomas's condition had been well known, and many had witnessed his seizures firsthand. The idea that epilepsy might finally claim his life seemed tragic, but not surprising. What did surprise some was Frederick's insistence on handling all the funeral arrangements himself, and his rejection of offers of help from neighbors and the local church. Frederick's medical training proved invaluable in maintaining the deception. He was able to speak knowledgeably about the physiological effects of severe seizures and explain why Thomas's body exhibited certain unusual characteristics. When the local minister, Reverend Isaiah Hartwell, expressed surprise at the speed with which Frederick wanted to proceed with the burial, Frederick explained that warm weather was expected and that rapid interment would be more hygienic. The funeral was held on March 2nd, just 2 days after Thomas's supposed death. Frederick had chosen a simple pine coffin and arranged for burial in the town cemetery, selecting a plot in a quiet corner where Thomas had often walked during his healthier periods. The service was well attended, with nearly half the town coming to pay their respects to the gentle young man who had endured so much suffering. During the service, Frederick maintained a stoic demeanor that impressed many mourners. What they interpreted as quiet strength was actually Frederick's desperate effort to avoid breaking down under the weight of his guilt and terror. He delivered a brief eulogy praising Thomas's courage in facing his illness and his kindness toward others, despite his own suffering. It was Reverend Hartwell who suggested the post-mortem photograph, a common practice in 1861 when photography was still expensive and many families had no other images of their deceased loved ones. Frederick initially resisted the idea, terrified that a photograph might somehow reveal the truth about Thomas's condition. But the Reverend's gentle insistence and the expectations of the community made refusal impossible without arousing suspicion. The photographer, a traveling professional named Samuel Morrison, who visited Millbrook monthly, arrived the morning before the funeral. Morrison was experienced in post-mortem photography and approached his work with the solemnity and skill that such occasions demanded. He had photographed dozens of deceased individuals throughout Massachusetts and Vermont, developing techniques for posing bodies and using lighting to create peaceful, dignified images. Frederick supervised the photography session with barely concealed anxiety. Morrison positioned Thomas in the coffin with his hands folded across his chest and arranged the lighting to minimize shadows that might reveal the unnatural quality of his skin. The photographer commented on how peaceful Thomas looked, noting that death had apparently come gently after so much suffering. The photographic process itself took nearly an hour, as Morrison used a large format camera that required long exposure times. Frederick found himself studying his brother's face during those long minutes, searching for any sign of life, any indication that Thomas might still be alive beneath the effects of the drugs. The stillness was complete, however, and Frederick began to convince himself that perhaps Thomas truly was dead, that the compounds had simply helped ease his passing. When Morrison finished and began packing his equipment, he mentioned that he would develop the daguerreotype in his Boston studio and send it to Frederick within the week. The photographer had captured what appeared to be a standard memorial portrait, a young man lying peacefully in death, surrounded by flowers and bathed in soft natural light. Frederick paid Morrison his fee and watched the man leave town, carrying with him the photographic plates that contained Thomas's image. As the carriage disappeared down the main road toward Boston, Frederick felt a mixture of relief and dread. The photograph would serve as evidence of Thomas's peaceful death, but it also represented a permanent record of Frederick's deception. The burial took place the following afternoon in a ceremony that drew nearly the entire town. Frederick stood at the graveside as Reverend Hartwell spoke about the mystery of suffering and the hope of eternal peace. As the first shovelfuls of earth fell onto the coffin, Frederick closed his eyes and tried to convince himself that he was simply burying his brother's earthly remains, that Thomas's spirit had already departed. The terrible discovery. For 3 weeks after Thomas's burial, Frederick attempted to return to normal life, but the weight of his secret made every day a struggle. His medical practice suffered as he found it difficult to concentrate on his patients' needs. Sleep came only with the aid of laudanum, and even then his dreams were filled with images of Thomas calling out from beneath the earth. The daguerreotype arrived from Boston on March 21st, delivered by the weekly mail coach, along with Frederick's usual correspondence and medical supplies. Morrison had done excellent work. The image was clear and beautifully composed, showing Thomas in peaceful repose surrounded by spring flowers. Frederick stared at the photograph for a long time, noting how lifelike Thomas appeared, almost as if he were merely sleeping. It was while examining the photograph more closely that Frederick noticed something that made his hands tremble. Along the edges of Thomas's fingernails, barely visible in the daguerreotype but unmistakable once seen, were what appeared to be scratches or marks. Frederick initially dismissed them as artifacts of the photographic process or shadows created by the lighting. But the more he studied the image, the more convinced he became that they were real. Driven by a growing sense of horror, Frederick retrieved his magnifying glass and examined the photograph under strong lamplight. The marks were definitely present, and they appeared to be scratches in the soft wood of the coffin where Thomas's hands rested. Even more disturbing, there seemed to be similar marks on the satin lining near Thomas's head, as if fingernails had clawed at the fabric. Frederick's medical knowledge immediately suggested a terrifying explanation. If Thomas had not been completely dead when buried, if the compounds had merely induced a death-like coma, then these marks might represent desperate attempts to escape from the coffin. The idea was so horrible that Frederick initially refused to accept it, but as he continued to study the photograph, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Sleep became impossible that night as Frederick wrestled with the implications of what he was seeing. If Thomas had been alive when buried, then Frederick was not just guilty of medical malpractice, but of murder through negligence. Worse still, his brother might have suffered unimaginably in those final moments, trapped in darkness and unable to call for help. The following day, Frederick could bear the uncertainty no longer. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would exhume Thomas's body under cover of darkness and discover the truth once and for all. March 23, 1861, was a moonless night with thick clouds that seemed to promise rain before dawn. Frederick waited until well past midnight before making his way to the cemetery, carrying a shovel and a dark lantern that he kept shuttered to avoid detection. The town was completely silent, with even the dogs seeming to sense that this was a night for staying indoors. The cemetery occupied a hillside overlooking the town, its weathered headstones and simple monuments marking the graves of Millbrook's residents going back nearly 2 centuries. Thomas's grave was located in the newer section, where the earth was still soft and the grass had not yet established itself. Frederick had chosen the location partially for its privacy, surrounded by old oak trees that would shield his activities from any possible observers. The digging was harder than Frederick had anticipated. Even after just 3 weeks, the earth had settled considerably, and the physical labor required was exhausting for a man weakened by weeks of sleepless nights and poor appetite. As he worked, Frederick found himself listening for any sound that might indicate discovery, but the night remained silent except for the rhythmic sound of his shovel breaking through the soil. It took nearly 3 hours to reach the coffin, and by then Frederick was soaked with perspiration despite the cool night air. When his shovel finally struck wood, the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Frederick used his hands to clear the remaining dirt from the coffin lid, noting that the simple pine construction had already begun to show signs of moisture and decay. The moment of truth came when Frederick pried open the coffin lid with a crowbar he had brought for the purpose. He raised his lantern to illuminate the interior, not certain what he would find, but fearing the worst. What he saw confirmed his most horrible suspicions and added details that would torment him for the rest of his life. Thomas's body had changed position since the burial. Instead of lying peacefully with his hands folded across his chest as he had been positioned for the funeral, his arms were raised toward the coffin lid, his fingers curved into claws. The satin lining of the coffin was shredded in multiple places, clearly torn by desperate fingernails. Most horrifying of all, Thomas's fingernails were bloody and broken, with splinters of wood embedded beneath them. The evidence was unmistakable. Thomas had awakened from his drug-induced coma while buried, and had spent his final hours in desperate attempts to escape his wooden prison. The scratches that Frederick had noticed in the photograph were only a small indication of the violent struggle that had taken place after burial. But Frederick's horror was far from complete. As he examined the coffin more closely by lantern light, he made an even more disturbing discovery. Carved into the wooden sides of the coffin, apparently scraped with fingernails and perhaps with the small metal clasp from Thomas's vest, were letters and partial words. Most were illegible, but one message was clear enough to read: "Fred, help." The sight of his brother's final desperate plea sent Frederick into a state of shock that left him trembling and nauseated. He had killed his brother, not through a single moment of medical error, but through a sustained act of cruelty that had condemned Thomas to the most horrible death imaginable. In the days following his terrible discovery, Frederick found himself unable to function normally. The weight of his guilt was compounded by a growing paranoia that someone might suspect the truth about Thomas's death. He began to examine his own behavior and motivations, trying to understand how he had descended from a caring physician into someone capable of such horrible negligence. It was during this period of self-examination that Frederick made another discovery that shattered what remained of his sanity. While organizing his medical journals and experimental notes, he came across records of previous patients who had died under similar circumstances. Deaths that he had previously attributed to the natural progression of their illnesses. The first case that caught his attention was Martha Henley, an elderly woman who had died the previous autumn while under Frederick's care for what she described as nervous disorders. Frederick had been treating her with experimental plant extracts similar to those he later used on Thomas. Martha had died suddenly during the night, and Frederick had attributed her death to heart failure brought on by her advanced age and poor health. Reviewing his notes about Martha's case, Frederick was horrified to realize that her symptoms before death had been nearly identical to Thomas's condition after receiving the experimental drugs. Martha had also exhibited the rigid limbs, barely detectable pulse, and death-like appearance that Frederick now understood might indicate a drug-induced coma rather than actual death. The records revealed more disturbing patterns. During his 18 months in Millbrook, Frederick had treated at least 6 patients with his experimental compounds, and 4 of them had died under circumstances that now seemed suspicious. All had been individuals suffering from nervous conditions, epilepsy, or chronic pain. People desperate enough to try experimental treatments and isolated enough that their deaths would not attract undue attention. James Whitfield, a farmer who had suffered from severe headaches following a fall from his barn, had died after receiving Frederick's plant-based treatments for pain relief. The death had been attributed to complications from his head injury, but Frederick's notes indicated that James had shown the same symptoms as Thomas before dying. Young Sarah Mills, barely 16 years old, had suffered from hysteria and fits that some townspeople attributed to demonic possession. Her family had brought her to Frederick as a last resort, and she had died after 3 weeks of treatment with Frederick's experimental compounds. Her death had been attributed to the severity of her condition, but Frederick now recognized the familiar pattern of symptoms. Most disturbing of all was the case of Timothy Watson, a Civil War veteran who had returned to Millbrook with what we would now recognize as what was then called soldier's heart, symptoms of psychological trauma from battle. Timothy had experienced nightmares, violent outbursts, and periods of deep melancholy that made normal life impossible. Frederick had treated him with experimental drugs intended to calm his mind, and Timothy had died suddenly after appearing to improve. As Frederick reviewed these cases with his new understanding of what his compounds could do, he realized that he might have buried alive not just his brother but potentially several other people. The thought that other innocent victims might have suffered Thomas's fate sent Frederick into a spiral of guilt and terror that made normal life impossible. The realization that he might have committed multiple murders transformed Frederick's guilt into something approaching madness. He began to experience symptoms that mirrored those of his former patient, Timothy Watson. Nightmares, paranoid delusions, and a growing inability to distinguish between reality and the horrific scenarios his imagination created. Frederick's medical practice collapsed as he became unable to treat patients without being overwhelmed by visions of their potential suffering. Every prescription he wrote, every treatment he recommended seemed to carry the possibility of inflicting the same horrible fate he had visited upon Thomas and possibly others. The townspeople of Millbrook began to notice Frederick's deterioration. Patients complained that he seemed distracted and nervous during examinations, often stopping mid-sentence to stare out the window or ask seemingly random questions about their families and burial preferences. His appearance became disheveled, and he developed a nervous habit of constantly washing his hands, as if trying to cleanse himself of invisible blood. Frederick's paranoia grew to encompass the entire town. He became convinced that people were watching him, waiting for evidence of his crimes. Every conversation seemed to contain hidden meanings. Every glance suggested suspicion. When children played in the cemetery near Thomas's grave, Frederick was certain they were looking for signs of disturbance. When Reverend Hartwell asked about his health during Sunday services, Frederick heard accusations in the minister's concerned words. The breaking point came in early June, when Frederick received a visit from Dr. Samuel Hayes of the Boston Medical Society. Hayes had come to Millbrook to discuss Frederick's application for membership in the society, a professional honor that would have significantly advanced his career. During their conversation, Hayes mentioned his interest in Frederick's research into plant-based treatments for nervous disorders. Frederick's reaction to this innocent inquiry was so extreme that it alarmed his visitor. He became agitated and defensive, insisting that his research had been purely theoretical and that he had never experimented on human subjects. When Hayes pressed for details about Frederick's published papers on alkaloid extracts, Frederick abruptly ended the meeting and asked his guest to leave immediately. That night, Frederick made his final decision. He could no longer bear the weight of his crimes, and he could not continue to live with the knowledge that other families might have lost loved ones to his reckless experimentation. He spent the entire night writing a detailed confession that outlined not only Thomas's death, but also his suspicions about the other patients who had died under his care. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millbrook intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Frederick's terrifying confession. Frederick's confession filled nearly 30 pages of careful handwriting, detailing not only the specific circumstances of each suspicious death, but also his methods for concealing the evidence and his growing realization of what he had done. The document revealed a systematic pattern of experimentation that had turned the entire town of Millbrook into Frederick's unwitting laboratory. The confession described how Frederick had carefully selected his victims from among the most vulnerable members of the community, those suffering from conditions that were poorly understood and for which conventional medicine offered little hope. These patients were often desperate enough to try experimental treatments and socially isolated enough that their deaths would not prompt extensive investigation. Frederick's methods had become increasingly sophisticated over time. He had learned to time his experimental treatments to coincide with periods when his patients' conditions were already deteriorating, making sudden death seem like a natural progression of their illnesses. He had also become skilled at mimicking the symptoms of various diseases, using his medical knowledge to make drug-induced deaths appear to be the result of heart failure, stroke, or complications from existing conditions. The confession revealed that Frederick had maintained detailed notes on all his experiments, including careful observations of the effects of different plant compounds and dosage levels. These notes were hidden in a secret compartment behind a bookshelf in his study, along with samples of the various alkaloids he had extracted and purified. Most chilling of all, the confession included Frederick's growing suspicion that some of his earlier victims might also have been buried alive. He described subtle signs he had noticed during the preparation of bodies for burial, fingernail damage that he had attributed to the final throes of death, minor changes in body position between the time of death and funeral preparation, and small tears in burial clothing that might have indicated struggle. After completing his confession, Frederick faced a choice between surrender to authorities and flight. The prospect of trial and execution terrified him, but equally frightening was the thought of the scandal that would engulf not only him, but also the innocent townspeople who had trusted him. The families of his victims would have to live with the knowledge that their loved ones had died horrible deaths through Frederick's negligence. Frederick chose flight, but not before taking steps to ensure that the truth would eventually be discovered. He sealed his confession along with his experimental notes and the damning daguerreotype of Thomas in a metal box, which he hid behind a false wall in the basement of his house. He left cryptic clues about the location of this evidence in letters to the Boston Medical Society and to Reverend Hartwell, knowing that eventually someone would piece together the mystery. On the night of June 15, 1861, Frederick Copeland disappeared from Millbrook, taking only a small bag of personal belongings and enough money to sustain him for a few weeks. He left behind a brief note claiming that grief over Thomas's death had made it impossible for him to continue practicing medicine in the town where his brother had died. Frederick's sudden departure created a sensation in Millbrook, particularly coming so soon after the tragedy of Thomas's death. The townspeople had difficulty understanding how a man who had seemed so devoted to his brother could abandon the practice and community he had worked so hard to build. Rumors circulated about gambling debts, romantic scandals, and even suggestions that Frederick had been secretly recruited for military service. The house on Elm Street stood empty for several months, while the town attempted to locate Frederick or his legal representatives. Eventually, the property was seized for unpaid taxes and sold to a family from Boston who planned to use it as a summer residence. It was during the renovation of the basement that workers discovered Frederick's hidden laboratory and the sealed box containing his confession. The discovery of Frederick's confession sent shockwaves through both Millbrook and the broader medical community. The detailed descriptions of his experiments and the evidence of multiple potential murders led to the exhumation of several bodies from the town cemetery. The investigation confirmed Frederick's worst fears. Physical evidence suggested that at least 3 of his former patients had indeed been buried alive. Martha Henley's remains showed the same signs of desperate struggle that had been found in Thomas's coffin. Her fingernails were broken and bloody, and the interior of her coffin bore scratches and tears that indicated frantic attempts to escape. The discovery prompted a more thorough examination of other suspicious deaths, revealing a pattern of medical murder that extended back to Frederick's earliest days in Millbrook. The investigation also uncovered Frederick's correspondence with colleagues in other cities, revealing that his experimental work was part of a broader network of physicians who were pushing the boundaries of medical ethics in their quest for breakthrough treatments. Several other doctors were investigated for similar practices, though none were found to have caused as many deaths as Frederick. The scandal effectively ended the careers of several prominent physicians who had been associated with Frederick's research, including Dr. Samuel Hayes, who had inadvertently triggered Frederick's final breakdown through his innocent inquiries about experimental treatments. The Boston Medical Society implemented new ethical guidelines for medical research and established procedures for monitoring physicians who worked with experimental drugs. The manhunt for Frederick Copeland became one of the most extensive criminal investigations in Massachusetts history, involving local law enforcement, federal marshals, and even Pinkerton detectives hired by the families of his victims. The search was complicated by the ongoing Civil War, which provided numerous opportunities for a fugitive to assume a new identity and disappear into the chaos of military recruitment and population displacement. Initial searches focused on the major cities where Frederick might have connections: Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Investigators discovered that Frederick had withdrawn substantial sums from his bank accounts in the weeks before his disappearance, suggesting that his flight had been planned in advance. They also found evidence that he had been purchasing supplies and equipment that would be useful for establishing a new medical practice under an assumed identity. The search eventually extended across the entire continent as reported sightings came in from as far away as California and Oregon Territory. A man matching Frederick's description had been seen working as a physician in a mining camp near Sacramento, but by the time investigators arrived, he had disappeared again. Another promising lead took detectives to a field hospital in Virginia, where a doctor with similar physical characteristics had been treating wounded soldiers. But this also proved to be a case of mistaken identity. What made the search particularly difficult was Frederick's medical training, which would allow him to establish a practice almost anywhere and quickly gain the trust and protection of local communities. Unlike most fugitives who had to resort to menial labor or criminal activities that would expose them to detection, Frederick could blend seamlessly into respectable society by simply presenting himself as a doctor seeking to help others. The investigation did reveal some disturbing patterns that suggested Frederick might be continuing his experimental work in his new location. Reports came in from several frontier towns of mysterious deaths among patients treated by itinerant physicians who matched Frederick's description. These cases shared the same characteristics as the Millbrook murders: vulnerable patients suffering from poorly understood conditions who died suddenly after receiving experimental treatments. As the years passed and the trail grew cold, public interest in the case began to fade. The Civil War dominated national attention, and the resources available for pursuing a single fugitive became increasingly limited. By 1865, the active search for Frederick Copeland had been largely abandoned, though his name remained on wanted lists and rewards were still offered for information leading to his capture. The final evidence. The most significant breakthrough in understanding the full scope of Frederick's crimes came in 1867, when renovation work at a church in Springfield, Massachusetts, uncovered a cache of documents that had apparently been hidden by Frederick during his flight. The papers included additional experimental notes, correspondence with other physicians involved in similar research, and most shocking of all, photographs of other victims that showed the same telltale signs of struggle that had been visible in Thomas's post-mortem portrait. These photographs revealed that Frederick had been documenting his experiments far more extensively than his Millbrook confession had indicated. The images showed patients in various stages of drug-induced comas, some clearly still alive despite appearing dead, others showing evidence of having awakened during burial preparation. The photos were accompanied by detailed notes describing the effects of different alkaloid combinations and dosage levels. The discovery of these additional photographs led to a new wave of investigations across New England, as authorities attempted to identify the victims and determine whether their deaths had been properly investigated at the time. Several cases that had been attributed to natural causes were reopened, and additional exhumations were ordered based on the evidence found in Frederick's hidden archive. The investigation revealed that Frederick's network of experimental physicians was far more extensive than initially believed. Doctors in at least 6 different states had been corresponding with Frederick about alkaloid research, sharing information about their own experiments and comparing results. Some of these physicians had also disappeared around the same time as Frederick, suggesting that the exposure of the Millbrook murders had triggered a broader collapse of the experimental network. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery that Frederick's research had been partially successful. His notes indicated that some of his experimental compounds had indeed shown promise for treating epilepsy and other nervous disorders, but his complete disregard for patient safety had turned potentially beneficial research into a series of horrific murders. The knowledge that his work might have led to legitimate medical breakthroughs made his crimes seem even more tragic and senseless. The Copeland case had far-reaching effects on American medicine and society that extended well beyond the immediate horror of the murders themselves. The revelation that a respected physician could systematically murder his patients while maintaining the facade of caring treatment shattered public trust in the medical profession and led to significant reforms in medical education and practice. Medical schools across the country implemented new ethical training requirements and established oversight procedures for experimental research. The case became a cautionary tale taught to generations of medical students, illustrating the dangers of allowing personal ambition and scientific curiosity to override basic human compassion and ethical constraints. The psychological impact on the community of Millbrook was profound and lasting. Many residents reported experiencing nightmares about being buried alive, and several families chose to have their deceased relatives cremated rather than buried, despite strong religious objections to the practice. The town cemetery, once a peaceful place for meditation and remembrance, became a source of fear and suspicion as people wondered which graves might contain evidence of Frederick's crimes. The case also contributed to growing public interest in the prevention of premature burial, a fear that had been present in society but which Frederick's crimes had made terrifyingly real. Inventors began developing safety coffins equipped with bells, speaking tubes, and escape mechanisms that would allow someone mistakenly buried alive to signal for help or free themselves. The Copeland murders became the subject of numerous newspaper articles, books, and even theatrical productions throughout the late 19th century. Each retelling seemed to add new, horrific details or speculative elements, transforming Frederick from a specific historical figure into a symbol of medical evil and unchecked scientific ambition. Religious leaders used the case as evidence of the dangers of placing too much faith in human knowledge and scientific progress over divine providence. The idea that a physician, someone sworn to preserve life, could become a systematic killer seemed to validate conservative warnings about the moral dangers of modern medicine and experimental science. Despite decades of investigation and numerous reported sightings, Frederick Copeland was never definitively located or captured. The last credible report placed him in the Dakota Territory in 1871. Where a physician matching his description had been treating settlers and soldiers at a remote frontier outpost. By the time investigators reached the location, however, the mysterious doctor had moved on, leaving behind only grateful patients and vague stories about his past. Some investigators theorized that Frederick had died during his years as a fugitive, possibly killed by hostile Indians, disease, or the harsh conditions of frontier life. Others believed that he had successfully established a new identity and continued practicing medicine under an assumed name, perhaps in a remote location where his past would never be discovered. The most disturbing theory, supported by a pattern of suspicious deaths that seemed to follow Frederick's trail across the continent, was that he had continued his experimental work throughout his fugitive years. Reports of mysterious deaths among patients treated by itinerant physicians created a trail of horror that stretched from Massachusetts to California, suggesting that Frederick's appetite for human experimentation had not been satisfied by his crimes in Millbrook. One particularly compelling account came from a mining camp in Colorado, where a doctor calling himself Francis Coleman had treated several miners for various ailments in 1869. 3 of his patients had died under circumstances remarkably similar to the Millbrook murders: sudden deaths following experimental treatments, rapid burial, and later evidence suggesting possible premature interment. The doctor had disappeared immediately after the 3rd death, taking with him detailed medical notes and a collection of plant specimens. Another credible sighting occurred in Oregon Territory in 1873, where a physician named Frederick Collins had established a practice in a small farming community. Local records indicated that Collins had an unusual interest in treating patients with nervous disorders and epilepsy using plant-based remedies that he claimed to have developed himself. When territorial authorities arrived to investigate reports of suspicious deaths, they found that Collins had vanished, leaving behind a laboratory filled with exotic plant extracts and detailed experimental notes. In 1875, 14 years after Thomas Copeland's death, a revelation emerged that added yet another layer of horror to the already nightmarish case. Samuel Morrison, the traveling photographer who had taken Thomas's post-mortem portrait, came forward with information that he had kept secret since the day of the photography session. Morrison revealed that during the lengthy exposure required for the daguerreotype, he had noticed subtle movements in Thomas's face and hands that had troubled him at the time. The movements were so slight that Morrison had attributed them to natural settling of the body, or perhaps shadows created by the flickering oil lamps used for illumination. However, the photographer's trained eye had detected what appeared to be very shallow breathing and occasional slight muscle contractions. Morrison had mentioned his observations to Frederick immediately after completing the photograph, expressing concern that perhaps Thomas was not actually dead, but merely in some form of deep unconsciousness. Frederick had dismissed these concerns, explaining that such movements were common in recently deceased individuals and resulted from the gradual cooling of the body and settling of body fluids. The photographer had accepted Frederick's explanation at the time, trusting the doctor's medical expertise over his own untrained observations. However, when news of Frederick's crimes became public, Morrison realized that his suspicions had been correct, and that he might have been the last person who could have saved Thomas Copeland's life. Morrison's revelation was particularly devastating because it indicated that Thomas's condition had been obvious enough for a non-medical observer to detect, meaning that Frederick must have been fully aware that his brother was still alive when he arranged for the burial. This transformed the case from medical negligence into deliberate murder, suggesting that Frederick had knowingly condemned his brother to death in order to conceal his experimental crimes. The photographer's testimony also raised disturbing questions about the other post-mortem photographs that Frederick had commissioned for his experimental victims. Morrison's records indicated that he had photographed at least 3 other patients of Frederick's who had died under similar circumstances, and in each case he had noticed the same subtle signs of life that he had observed in Thomas. The revelation about Morrison's observations sent the community of Millbrook into a state of near panic that persisted for years after Frederick's disappearance. Residents became obsessed with the fear of premature burial, and several families demanded that recently buried relatives be exhumed for examination. The town cemetery became a scene of constant activity as investigations continued, and families sought reassurance about their loved ones. The psychological impact on the townspeople was profound and long-lasting. Many residents reported being unable to sleep, haunted by thoughts of their deceased relatives, potentially suffering the same fate as Thomas Copeland. Some families took extreme precautions, such as delaying burials for extended periods or insisting on elaborate procedures to verify death before interment. Local physician Dr. William Brennan, who had taken over Frederick's practice, found himself overwhelmed not only with medical cases but also with demands from anxious residents for reassurance about deaths that had occurred months or even years earlier. Dr. Brennan was forced to develop new protocols for verifying death, including extended observation periods and multiple examinations before declaring a patient deceased. The fear of premature burial became so pervasive that it began to affect the living as well as concerns about the dead. Several residents developed what we would now recognize as panic disorders, becoming convinced that they themselves might fall victim to the kind of death-like coma that had claimed Thomas and others. This fear led to an epidemic of hypochondria and anxiety that further taxed the community's psychological resources. The local church, led by Reverend Hartwell, attempted to provide spiritual comfort and rational perspective on the crisis, but even religious faith seemed inadequate to address the horror of what had been discovered. Sunday sermons that once focused on salvation and eternal life now grappled with questions about suffering, evil, and the failure of trusted institutions to protect the innocent. The exposure of Frederick Copeland's crimes sent shockwaves through the American medical establishment that reverberated for decades. Medical journals published extensive analyses of the case, attempting to understand how a properly trained physician could descend into such systematic evil and what safeguards might prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Boston Medical Society, which had unknowingly been in correspondence with Frederick about his research, launched a comprehensive investigation into experimental medical practices throughout New England. The investigation revealed that Frederick's crimes were part of a broader pattern of unethical experimentation that had been largely hidden from public view and professional oversight. Several prominent physicians were found to have been conducting similar research using human subjects without proper consent or safety protocols. While none were found to have committed murders on the scale of Frederick's crimes, the investigation revealed a troubling disregard for patient welfare among researchers who prioritized scientific advancement over human safety. The scandal led to the establishment of new professional standards for medical research and practice. Medical schools implemented mandatory courses in medical ethics, and professional organizations developed codes of conduct that explicitly prohibited human experimentation without informed consent. These reforms represented some of the earliest attempts to regulate medical research and protect patients from exploitation. The case also sparked broader debates about the role of science in society and the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. Critics argued that the pursuit of medical knowledge had become disconnected from moral considerations, creating conditions where researchers could treat human beings as experimental subjects rather than individuals deserving of care and respect. As news of the Copeland case spread beyond American borders, it prompted investigations into similar practices in other countries. European medical authorities launched reviews of experimental research programs, particularly those involving alkaloid compounds and treatments for nervous disorders. Several cases of suspicious deaths were identified that shared characteristics with Frederick's murders. The international scope of the investigation revealed that Frederick had been part of a network of researchers that extended across the Atlantic. Correspondence found in his hidden archives included letters from physicians in London, Paris, and Vienna, who were conducting similar experiments with plant-based compounds. Some of these foreign colleagues had also disappeared around the time that Frederick's crimes were exposed, suggesting that the scandal had triggered a broader collapse of the experimental network. British authorities identified at least 2 cases in London where patients treated with experimental alkaloids had died under circumstances similar to the Millbrook murders. French investigators found evidence of a research program in Paris that had resulted in several unexplained deaths among patients suffering from epilepsy and other nervous conditions. These discoveries suggested that Frederick's crimes were part of a much larger pattern of medical murder that had been occurring throughout the Western world. The international investigation also revealed the extent to which unregulated medical research had been exploiting vulnerable populations. Patients suffering from poorly understood conditions like epilepsy, hysteria, and what was then called neurasthenia had been seen as ideal subjects for experimental treatments because their conditions were often considered hopeless by conventional medicine. In 1889, 28 years after Frederick Copeland's disappearance, a final piece of evidence emerged that provided both closure and new mysteries. A package arrived at the Boston Medical Society with no return address, containing a daguerreotype and a brief note written in handwriting that experts confirmed belonged to Frederick. The photograph showed an elderly man lying in what appeared to be a simple wooden coffin, positioned in the same manner as Thomas Copeland's post-mortem portrait. The man's face was gaunt and weathered, suggesting a life of hardship, but his features were recognizably those of Frederick Copeland, aged by nearly 3 decades of fugitive existence. The accompanying note was brief but chilling. The final subject of my research. May God have mercy on my soul, and may my victims find peace in death that they were denied in life. The experiments are complete. The note was dated simply Winter 1889 with no location indicated. Medical experts who examined the photograph noted the same subtle signs that Samuel Morrison had observed in Thomas's portrait decades earlier, evidence suggesting that the subject might not have been completely dead when the photograph was taken. The implications were horrifying. Frederick appeared to have conducted his final experiment on himself, possibly inducing the same death-like coma that had doomed his brother and other victims. The package also contained a small vial of crystalline powder and detailed notes describing its composition and effects. Analysis revealed that Frederick had refined his alkaloid compounds over the decades, developing what appeared to be a more precise formula for inducing reversible death-like states. The notes suggested that he had finally achieved the scientific breakthrough he had been seeking, but at the cost of countless lives and his own sanity. The Frederick Copeland case became one of the most notorious medical crimes in American history, establishing precedents for medical ethics and patient protection that continue to influence healthcare practice today. The case demonstrated the importance of oversight and regulation in medical research, particularly when dealing with experimental treatments and vulnerable patient populations. The horror of Thomas Copeland's death and the systematic nature of Frederick's crimes captured the public imagination in ways that influenced popular culture for generations. The case inspired numerous works of fiction, from Gothic novels to early horror films, and established many of the tropes that continue to appear in medical horror stories today. Perhaps most importantly, the case served as a catalyst for the development of modern medical ethics and patient rights. The reforms implemented in response to Frederick's crimes laid the groundwork for the informed consent procedures, research oversight committees, and patient advocacy protections that are now standard practice in medical care. The town of Millbrook eventually recovered from the trauma of Frederick's crimes, but the case left permanent changes in the community's character. The cemetery where Thomas and Frederick's other victims were buried became a site of pilgrimage for those interested in medical history and the dark side of scientific progress. A memorial erected in 1901 honors the victims and serves as a reminder of the importance of maintaining ethical standards in medical practice. This mystery shows us how the pursuit of knowledge, when divorced from compassion and ethical constraints, can transform healers into monsters and turn scientific progress into instruments of horror. The Copeland case reminds us that medical advancement must always be balanced with respect for human dignity and the fundamental principle that patients must be protected, not exploited, by those entrusted with their care. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Frederick Copeland's fate? Or do you think there are still secrets buried in the archives of medical history? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what really happened to the doctor who photographed death before it arrived. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. See you in the next video.